Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Today is Monday. Today is the 9th day of October in the year 2017. It is a pleasure to be with you live. As I'm sure you are aware, regular listeners at least, we were not able to do live programming last week. It dealt with medical issues. We had a number of people that were under the weather. In fact, in chatting with Bob before we came on the air, there's still a little bit of that going on. But be that as it may, we are here, we are live today, and I want to thank you for your continued support of this program and of Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On as well. It's very, very important. I think one of the issues that we deal with in today's program is going to speak pretty directly to the importance of programming like you hear regularly and you engage in on the Head On Radio Network. Bob's introduction always refers to the continuing conversation that really drives the vision for this program. And of course, I am quite aware that conversations usually require more than one person. And I'm also quite aware that more often than not, we don't have that, anything except one person. And so, in effect, our conversation becomes more dialogue than anything else. I do encourage you to participate actively in our program, and I hope that you understand as well that even when there's nobody on the air with me, I try to do the best I can to frame what we're talking about in the context of conversation and try to speculate that if there were somebody else involved, they probably would say this or look at the issue under discussion this way or that way or whatever. Because I do recognize the importance of conversation in any kind of dialogue, any kind of agreement, any kind of learning process, because I do believe that we learn from each other. And I continue to believe that. So again, thank you for your continued support of this program. I call your attention to the fact that if you would like to call, you can call by going through Bob Kincaid at Skype and get us on the phone that way. Also, if you'd like to drop me an email and share your thoughts with me that way, I would be glad to, with your permission, to get your ideas on the air in your stead, and I will do the very best I can to represent your interests and your priorities as well. I will refrain from editorializing as much as possible because I really think that the most important thing is to get your ideas on the air as you expressed those ideas, and I'll do the very best I can to do that. If you trust me with an email to do that, I'd be honored to do it. Also, I call your attention to our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, the homepage, there's a search box at the top, and if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be onto our Facebook page, and there are continuing to be a number of postings there, links to articles that I felt were valuable and worth a serious look by those people that support and continually support this program. And also I put some materials on the Facebook page related to the class that I'm teaching. Obviously that class, even though it's just one, is taking an incredible amount of time. One of the reasons being the size of the group. I mean, we have in excess of 80 students enrolled in this one class. I think we've lost a few, I would guess. I think now that as I look at my grade book, I think there are 79 people in this class that, as of now, are getting a grade. And so we've lost a few. A couple of people that originally signed up for the program never showed, and hadn't dropped the program, hadn't dropped the class, or withdrawn from it quick enough to get their name off the roll. So, but they never came. So consequently, you can't count them. And then I'm sure we've lost 3 or 4 people along the way as well. But still, the fact remains that the size of the class makes anything related to the class a somewhat daunting initiative or experience. Just dealing with that many people, and I'm finding out now that we've been at it going on 2 months. We started on the 16th of August, and met the class this morning. Today is the 10th of October, so we're fast approaching 2 months. And that leaves another month and a half to go. The final exam will be somewhere around between the 5th and the 10th of December. So we still have better than a month to go, although we will be missing the week of Thanksgiving. The classes at the university are suspended for that entire week. So that's 1 week that I'll be relieved from the responsibilities of teaching the class. But on the other hand, I don't want to make this sound as a negative experience. It's a positive experience for me. I enjoy it very, very much. I hope that the students are getting something out of the class at least. If there is a direct relationship between effort put into a class and what students get out of it, then most students should be getting something out of this class, because I know from my end that I'm doing everything I can do to make it a worthwhile educational experience for those students who are enrolled in it. And again, it's more than anything else. It's kind of what I do. It's what I've done for my entire professional life, and I find I get very, very my own personal rewards out of doing something like this. So, please don't get the idea that I'm doing it only for the benefit of the university, or believe me, it's not for the money. I can tell you that. I can tell you that right now. If you've done any reading on higher education, you may recognize that we have reached the point now where better than 50% of students enrolled in college classes are being taught by part-time instructors, so-called adjunct instructors, or contingent faculty is a more acceptable term that I've heard people use. And what that means is you're not full-time, you don't get benefits, you don't get the benefit of a salary, etc. You just get a fee for teaching a particular class. And that fee is, for the most part, rather low. It really doesn't merit or in any way match the time necessary to make the class a worthwhile experience. But anyway, be that as it may, it is a pleasure to be here with you on this Monday edition of the Virtual Center. I hope everyone is well. We did miss our entire time together last week, and of course, what that meant was that the experience of what occurred in Las Vegas on Sunday a week ago, we haven't had the opportunity here at the Virtual Center to deal with at all. I mentioned to Bob before we went on the air today that I had sat down and wrote a small piece, which I maybe will share with some of you today on our program if the opportunity presents itself. But I basically saw a connection between the move by the National Rifle Association, the move by the NRA to engage in discussions or to, and Bob and I chatted about this before we went on the air, the NRA pretty much gave its permission for the rest of us to discuss the question of banning the so-called bump stock gizmos that go on semi-automatic weapons and make them automatic. And, of course, we know that a number of the weapons used in the massacre in Las Vegas last week were equipped with this so-called bump stock mechanism. And my point, as I was writing, was that I am not a gun expert. I'm far from it. I not only don't know how they work, I really don't care how they work. The fact that they do work worries me. And especially when I relate that to the kind of people that are now able to carry weapons, to arm themselves. It seems to me not a very comforting situation at all, at least for me. And so, consequently, I saw the situation with the NRA's involvement, or somewhat of, semi-involvement, we could say, because I've noticed in the last day or two that the NRA has kind of backtracked a little bit and said they weren't ultimately going along with banning bump stocks, but they definitely did support the idea of discussing the feasibility and the positive aspects of some form of regulation for this particular mechanism. And as I thought about that, it dawned on me that this particular so-called concession by the NRA, which has got a lot of people excited, many people will say, finally, a breakthrough. Finally, the NRA is taking the threat of gun violence seriously. The fact of the matter is, so many people in this country are so desperate for some sort of agreement or regulatory move on weapons that they could be cutting off their nose to spite their face, is my position on this. I don't think that the NRA's position on bump stocks is significant. I don't think it's going to have a significant impact on gun violence or the number of people that are wounded or killed as a result of weapons in the hands of not all their people, I guess we could say. I think in the long term, the NRA would get more out of this kind of a concession than the concession itself would be worth. I think all the arguments against the obstinacy of the NRA would be gone. In other words, I think that what would look like a concession on the part of the NRA would in fact turn out to be a victory by the NRA. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized that I kind of agreed with that. I also recalled that that's somewhat very similar to the situation in 1786 with the calling of the Annapolis Convention. And I know we've talked about the Annapolis Convention leading to the Constitutional Convention many times here on the Virtual Center over the months and years that we've been on. And one of the things that occurred to me is the situation is somewhat similar between this situation with NRA and bump stocks as it was about the convening of the Annapolis Convention in September of 1786. The way the textbooks deal, if they deal at all, with the Annapolis Convention is that the convention was called, but only 9 states sent delegates. 4 refused to do so. One of the 4, I think significantly, is Maryland, which happened to be the host state. The convention itself was meeting in Annapolis, the state capital at that time. And yet the Maryland legislature refuses to participate in that conference, even though it's happening in their state capital. That seems to me to be significant. The other thing that's very significant is that even though 9 states appointed delegates to attend the Annapolis Convention, the delegates from 4 states never showed up. According to the letter written by the French charge d'affaires Otto back to Vergennes in France in October of 1786, the delegation from 4 states were delayed in New York and never made it to Annapolis in time to participate in the Annapolis Convention. That meant that on paper, at least, the Annapolis Convention was a failure. Only 5 states of the 13 ended up being represented there. And the way our textbooks present the story, Alexander Hamilton was able to snatch victory from apparent defeat when he was able to get a resolution through the Annapolis Convention from the delegates who were there to call yet another convention the following May in Philadelphia. This, of course, becomes the Constitutional Convention. And the call for that particular convention, unlike the Annapolis Convention, didn't just focus on commercial matters. It focused on all matters relevant to the exigencies of the Union. In other words, it opened up the prospects for a major revision of the Articles of Confederation. And we know, of course, that the revision is so significant that once the convention opens, the decision is made to scrap the Articles of Confederation entirely and to instead begin the process of discussing a totally new government. And it's at that point that Governor Randolph distributes copies of the Virginia Plan, which is put together by James Madison, and that becomes the outline of the Constitutional Convention. What Otto's letter to Vergennes reveals is that Hamilton and Madison, especially the leaders in the calling of the Annapolis Convention, really didn't want the Annapolis Convention to be successful. The reason it was called was to discuss trade, commerce, between and among the states. The idea stemmed from a meeting held in March of 1785, the year before, at Mount Vernon. That meeting was called specifically by representatives from Virginia and Maryland to discuss commercial regulations between the 2 states. We know, for example, that the Potomac River divides the 2 states, divides Maryland and Virginia. Also, Chesapeake Bay itself links Maryland and Virginia. And so there were any number of commercial conflicts between these 2 states that motivated the delegates to decide that it might be a good idea to sit down and discuss their differences and reach some sort of accord on trade between the 2 states. It's important to mention, although I don't know that it's that important to the story as a whole, but I think it's important to mention that this meeting on trade between Virginia and Maryland under the Articles of Confederation was illegal, because the Articles of Confederation specifically banned individual agreements between states within the Confederation. But be that as it may, once the convention convenes, the meeting convenes in Virginia, the delegates relocate to Mount Vernon. George Washington invites them to Mount Vernon for their meeting. And out of that meeting comes the recognition that other states have commercial concerns as well as Virginia and Maryland. Maybe commercial matters might be the way that we could get all the states together to discuss more important things than just commerce, like the very nature of the Articles of Confederation itself. That leads the group at Mount Vernon to put out a general call to all the states to send delegates to Annapolis in September of 1786 to discuss trade and commercial matters among the states at Annapolis. And as I mentioned, 4 states didn't show up. And of the 9 that did appoint delegates to attend, 4 of the states never had their elected representatives show up at all at the Annapolis Convention. Otto, in his letter to Vergennes, indicates that Hamilton and Madison really didn't want the Annapolis Convention to be successful because their ultimate goal was revision or totally scrapping the Articles of Confederation. If Annapolis had been successful, if the states had been able to work out their commercial differences, Otto suggests that Hamilton and Madison realized that if the states were able to come together and reach accord on commercial matters, that would weaken the opportunity to bring the states together to discuss the nature of the articles as a whole. In other words, the ultimate objective would be much more difficult for them to attain if the Annapolis Convention's meeting on commerce had been successful. Consequently, Otto's interpretation to Vergennes, the French foreign minister, was that from the very beginning, the architects of the Annapolis Convention didn't want it to work at all. Rather, commercial considerations was, according to Otto, a pretext, a way to get all the delegates from the different states together so that the conversation could then turn to the adequacy of the Articles of Confederation, and that was really the ultimate objective of the architects of Annapolis, namely Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. So in effect, Hamilton didn't snatch victory from almost sure defeat at all. In fact, the defeat of the success of the Annapolis Convention was the plan, was the goal. Because what that made it possible for Hamilton to do was put out a general call for what becomes the Constitutional Convention in May 1787. I saw a very similar situation with the NRA's position on this bump stock matter. By making a rather minor concession that really didn't constitute a concession at all, because chances of it having any impact on gun violence in this country are minimal. What it would in fact do would be insulate the NRA from all the negative criticism that has been thrown its way as a result of the NRA's opposition to any kind of meaningful reform on regulation of firearms. So in a sense, just as the failure of the Annapolis Convention was really a victory for its planners, so also the apparent concessions on guns, on bump stocks by the NRA would in fact turn out not to be a concession at all, but an ultimate victory for the NRA. And that's really the gist of the article that I wrote this weekend in response to the violence in Las Vegas. Like everyone else, I think I was glued to the television, as many people were, as the story of the massacre that occurred a week ago Sunday evening in Las Vegas was unfolding before us. We haven't had a chance to get together since that event. And I did feel that it was necessary to at least comment on it. I think it's very interesting that the frustration that is becoming more and more evident because people can't seem to find the real intent that motivated the perpetrator of this violence. He wasn't poor, he wasn't out of a job, etc. He was a heavy gambler. He had money. There didn't seem to be, at least so far, nobody's been able to find a reason for this kind of thing. Maybe just the ability to do it is reason enough. Who knows? But I think there is a tendency in society to assume that anyone who does this kind of thing, that commits this kind of violent act, must be deranged in one way or another. And that immediately leads people to look for the reason, if you will. I don't know. I know that I'm very concerned, not only by the availability of guns, but by the nature of the people who have them. More specifically, the nature of the people who want them. I think we just nominated one to be Republican Senate candidate from Alabama, if I'm not mistaken. Roy Moore was seen in news video waving a gun, a pistol, at his own rally. So I think we're seeing trends in the country that are very, very frightening. But be that as it may, I don't want to take all of our time on today's program, since it is the first one, with that. One of the things that I had planned that I thought we would address last week was related to the class I'm teaching. And one of the things that I've begun to do, and I think all of you who listen regularly are aware of this, whatever I find that I'm doing in classes I teach, I find it very, very helpful to share with the people who regularly listen to the Virtual Center programs. Because I see the Virtual Center as a digital form of education. I mean that. In fact, one of the things that I find particularly exhilarating about my experience here at the Virtual Center is that over the months and over the years that we've been doing this, it seems to me at least that I've begun to discover the way that the internet, distance delivery, if you will, can contribute to the quality of education in the country, as well as ways that it won't. I've mentioned before, I know, and I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but if you think back 40, 50 years, many people believed that television would revolutionize education in this country. The television presented an opportunity to deliver education in ways that never before existed. And the assumption was that the introduction of television into the educational life of this country would end up having very positive impacts on the level of education throughout the country. I've also been witness to the fact that that optimism was to a large degree misplaced. Many people who study the subject believe that if television did anything to affect quality of education, it was negative. And part of the reason for that is that, to coin a phrase, when it came to the delivery of instruction via television and now by the internet, what we have seen are examples of the medium becoming the message. The mere fact that we had the opportunity to deliver instruction in ways that we never had before basically descended, if you will, into the idea that instruction is education. And so therefore, if you define education as the ability to deliver information, then by definition, television and later the internet had to be a positive, because it made the delivery of information much more efficient, much more effective, much more viable. The result is that more and more television was incorporated into our educational experience at all levels. Classes without video, classes without audio-visual enhancement, if you will, were increasingly considered to be less than adequate classes. And institutions began to define the best classes by the amount of technology in them. But in effect, what that technology was doing was redefining education itself. It was creating or feeding the illusion that the delivery of information is education. The result was that as more and more money was spent on technology, it almost seemed as if it was having a negative impact on the quality of education. Scores continued to go down. More and more students were tending to withdraw, to quit school once they were legally able to do so. It seemed like education was taking a step backward rather than forward as a result of this technology. One of the things that I've discovered in the 4+ years, if you will, that we've been doing the Virtual Center is that technology makes it possible to enhance education, provided it's used the right way, provided it's not misused. And that means the possibility of interactive dialogue, of conversation, if you will. The promise of enhanced dialogue and enhanced conversation does enhance the value of and the quality of education. And I've basically been able to learn that here on the Virtual Center. So to go back to the point that I was making, I have not been at all shy about sharing thoughts I've had in the classroom with listeners here at the Virtual Center, and vice versa. I have found it very valuable at times to share with students in classes some of the more positive experiences we've had here on the Virtual Center. I can think back over the years to the programs that I felt were incredibly exhilarating, that the educational experience just came through so clearly. And to a large extent, these were the programs where we had more than just one person talking. And it made me realize calls that we received over the months and years from people, you know, and I'm just using Horst as an example because he's been a regular caller. But the dialogue that his calls often lead to, most often lead to, have produced some of the best programs on the entire initiative, entire effort, the Virtual Center itself, I do believe. So one of the issues that I was going to share last week is some of the innovation that I'm trying to implement in this class I'm teaching. First of all, let me share with you something that I'm personally a little bit proud of. And that is that even though I've been teaching for as long as I have, I have not yet allowed myself to slide into the idea that everything is in the can. All I've got to do is what I always did, and it becomes so automatic that it minimizes the need for preparation time and all the rest of it. I haven't allowed myself to fall into that trap. I continue to develop. I continue to add nuances to the material that I'm trying to get across to students. One of the things that I've become very, very aware of as far as education is concerned is the reality of assessment, the need to assess, the need to evaluate effective teaching, effective learning. And one of the things I've realized is that the way we grade students works against academic quality. What do I mean by that? As long as we continue to pit student against student within the classroom and using grades as the measure to distinguish or to discriminate between the stronger students and students who are not as strong, as long as we continue to do that, we are working against the best interests of educational quality. It's impossible to measure or to assess academic quality when you approach grading that way. Because what you're really doing is comparing students one with another, not assessing effective teaching. The only way to really assess effective teaching is to evaluate student progress in the course. In other words, the best way for me to know that what I'm doing is working is by trying to evaluate the impact that what I'm doing is having on students. If I can establish a track record within the class for each student. I can measure the progress of that student from this piece of work to the next piece of work to the next piece of work, etc. And that's the way to effectively assess the quality of education. If students are able to do things now that they were not able to do at the beginning, not only that, not only do things now that they weren't able to do, but do them better as time goes on, then it seems to me you've got the documentation necessary to evaluate the educational quality of that particular experience. Obviously, if students are going backwards, then that raises serious questions about how well you're doing what you're trying to do. One of the best devices for this is not only submission of papers, but exams themselves. It seems to me that the quality of education can be measured in how student performance from exam to exam improves. And what that means is the nature of tests, of exams, becomes critical. And one of the things that I've been doing this semester in this course is looking at each piece of work that I ask students to do and to submit as a step in a process. The first assignment that I gave these students was to evaluate or to interpret a document, a primary document. I believe I mentioned it here on the Virtual Center. The document that I gave them was the John Winthrop speech on liberty, delivered in 1641, I believe, to the General Assembly in Massachusetts. The next step in that kind of a process is to ask students to compare two documents on the same thing, two different points of view on the same problem or the same challenge, the same issue. To compare and contrast one approach to an issue with another. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each? Is there a way to draw positives from both positions and to come up with yet an even better way to do this? So in a sense, what you are doing is increasing the complexity of the challenge presented to students. And their ability to handle these from one assignment to the next assignment is a way to assess the quality of education that's happening in this particular class. The same thing is true with exams. One of the options that I had thrown out to students was the option of take-home exams. Exams that they wouldn't take in class, but rather could complete at home. Now, what that obviously means is they would have access to resources. They would have access to the internet. They would have access to a textbook. They would have access to notes that they took in class. They would have access to the internet, access to libraries. But the other thing to keep in mind is the nature of the questions need to be different. In an exam in which students are going to sit in the class and answer questions, student mastery of the information becomes critical, becomes the critical measure. In a class that only lasts an hour, 50 minutes, which is a traditional class at the college level, a student who is going to take an exam over 50 minutes is not going to have time to think about the answer. The thinking has to have been done before the student comes in to take the exam. All that 50 minutes gives you is the time to write down what you know. That's not the kind of an exam you want to give as a take-home. In fact, it's exactly the kind of exam question you don't want to give in a take-home. The last thing you want to do is ask students questions where they can go to a particular website or a particular place in the textbook and find the answers. I can remember when I was doing my practice teaching many years ago in a middle school, it was in 8th grade, actually. It was an 8th grade government class that I was teaching. And one of the class assignments that students used to do, and I was taught to do this wasn't my practice teaching experience, so I was working with a regular full-time teacher. One of the assignments that the teacher used to do all the time was ask students halfway through the class to open their textbooks and answer the questions at the end of the chapter. So basically what you would see students doing, of course, is look at the question and then rapidly thumbing through the chapters looking for the answers. I can remember well one student, a young girl, who raised her hand and asked me for help. And I went over there and she said, I'm trying to answer this question. I know the answers in this paragraph. And I said, yes, it is. And she said, which end? And I thought to myself, this is absurd. So if you give that kind of a question on a take-home exam, where students could just go to a particular chapter of the book or a particular page in a chapter and find all the information they need to answer the question, your exam really isn't measuring anything. It's not evaluating anything, except the student's ability to find the answers on the right pages or the right websites or internet sites or whatever. The questions for an in-class exam need to be more cerebral. They need to be more reflective. And what I had planned in one of our classes, one of our times programs last week that didn't happen, and what I'd like to share with you now is an example of how this worked for my own class. If you'll bear with me for a moment. I think I can make the point. If you just give me a moment to lay my hands on the documents in question. I believe I have it here. Here we go. Let me share with you questions on an in-class exam that I gave to students. They had 50 minutes. They had to pick two of these questions in 50 minutes and answer them. So each question was 50 points. By definition, the answers to the questions had to have been composed earlier. Students didn't have enough time to start thinking about these questions in the class itself. All they had time to do was get down what they know. Let me give you examples of the questions I asked. These are from early American history prior to the Declaration of Independence. In other words, the British Empire, the structure and behavior of the British Empire, and the development of the 13 colonies up until the decision for American independence in 1776. Here's the first question. I asked students, write an essay entitled Mercantilism and Leadership, in which you explain mercantilism from the mother country's perspective or point of view. Make sure you address ways nations looked at the world, links nations made between wealth and international power, and the logic that led to exploration and ultimately colonization. In other words, put yourself in the position of one of these new governments, one of the kings or queens of these major nations. How do they look at the world? How do they look at relations with other nations, with their competitors? How does wealth play into that? How does the need to acquire wealth and natural resources lead to colonization, ultimately exploration and then colonization? That's what I was looking for in students, was an appreciation of that worldview in that essay. Here's another one. Write an essay on community in 17th century Chesapeake America, in which you examine efforts to achieve a sense of order and stability there in the Chesapeake colonies, which of course Virginia and Maryland specifically. Focus on issues like incentives for settlement, mechanisms to govern, attitudes towards work, the search for a workable labor system, social institutions, the impact of available land in the West, in assessing factors that contribute to community and others that made community more difficult. Why did government want to create a sense of community? It obviously made governing easier. So what you would try to do as a government is to promote policies and programs that link people together and give them a common sense, a common point of view, if you will. So I asked students to write an essay on the Chesapeake colony specifically and government pursuit of community there. Of course, what I was after is the indentured servant system as a way to populate the colonies and the gradual introduction of slavery and what the idea of slavery did to the concept of community. And out of that comes the full-blown slave system that we all know so very well. A third question. Compare and contrast the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. How were they similar? How were they different? Does any of that matter? The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement. The Great Awakening was a religious revival movement. By definition, the two of them affected totally different people. Only certain people were drawn to the philosophies of the Enlightenment. A totally different kind of person is drawn to the revivals being held at camp meetings throughout the South and the West. The next question I asked them to deal with is the idea of social stratification. The idea of a society organized on the principle that all men are not equal. Does there seem to be justifiable evidence to support this in American colonial society before 1776, I asked. Are we looking at a society that is operating around the principle of what sociologists call social stratification? And then I provided this information. John Adams, along with others, spoke often about what they termed a natural aristocracy, the idea that some people were born to lead, the majority to follow. Does there seem to be a decline of sorts in relative equality that becomes more pronounced as economic development occurs? As we see economic development happening in colonial America, do we begin to see an increase in what we call social stratification, gaps between rich and poor, between the wealthy and the not wealthy? And then finally, the last question refers to a historical interpretation of American independence. Carl Becker, the American historian, in his doctoral thesis on the independence movement in this colony of New York, made the controversial statement that, quote, there were really two revolutions going on there. One to determine home rule, the other to determine who will rule at home. Becker goes on to conclude, at least in New York, that the second revolution, who will rule at home, is really more important than the first one, whether the colonies will be independent from Britain or not. Can you trace evidences that seem to indicate the realities of an internal revolution that often dictates the nature of colonial responses to actions taken by the mother country? Excuse me. To an extent, each of those questions speaks to a particular body of information. And if students have that information, they can answer that question. So the nature of an in-class exam, by definition, is to test student mastery of information, not reflection, not intellectual depth, not analysis or critical thinking, but straight out presentation of information. That's the nature of in-class exams. Take-home exams, however, are different. So what I did was make up 3 questions that would be questions on the same material that would be more conducive for a take-home exam, because the answers are not that easily recognizable. They're not things you can look up. Let me share with you these questions. And we got about 2 minutes left before the top of the hour. If we go over a couple of minutes, that'll be okay. And then we can begin something totally different when we come back after break. Here's the first question. You are a loyalist, a colonist in 1776 who isn't rich, but you're not poor either. What makes it so special raising your family in America is that there's always hope, always tomorrow. You know that everything you are, everything you have, everything you hope to be, exists only because you were lucky enough to grow up and raise your family as a subject of the British king. The empire has always been there. It's always been something you could rely on for peace, order, stability, predictability. You're sure about tomorrow because your king has always been there to make sure it's going to be good for you. For the most part, it has been good to you. But now there's talk of independence. You're opposed to it, whatever the arguments made for it. They're persuasive, but they don't begin to dent your faith in what is. What you know will be your tomorrow. Change? Don't even talk to me about it. Don't try to persuade me on it. Here's why. Here's my case. Make the case from your reading of colonial America for staying within the empire. That's a question that takes some thought. It requires information, but it requires carefully selected information. And your ability to put that together is going to be determined by how well you understand the material altogether. It's much more reflective. Here's another one, back to the Carl Becker situation. Carl Becker argued that the internal revolution, the debate over who should rule at home, was more important in understanding the movement for American independence than what went on between Mother Country and her American colonies. Needless to say, there are many so-called experts who challenged him on this. Just so happens that you've been invited to a debate on exactly this question. Moreover, you've been given the honor of picking the winner of that debate. Both sides have made their case. Both are very solid and persuasive. But you've made your decision. It's time to announce it to your audience. Who wins the debate? Why? Obviously, once again, a much more reflective question than the first one of evidence to support this and evidence to support that. Here's another one, third question. There are many who argue that American history, the course as it's currently taught in our colleges and universities, wastes far too much time covering what happened in Europe before the colonies were even founded. Even more to the point, it's largely a waste of time, they argue, to spend so much time on colonial history, on the colonial period. Who cares what happened inside 13 different colonies over the 170 years between 1606 and 1776? Let's just begin the course with the start of the independence movement after 1763 and stick with what matters most. Now, as I've told the students, well, you've been through some of that wasted time. We've covered the colonial period. You've read and heard about much that happened during the colonial period. Address the controversy above in ways that resolve it once and for all. Is colonial history a waste of time? Or does it have something of real value toward one's understanding of American history? Make your case and back it up. Each of those questions is much more cerebral, much more reflective, much better way to get at student understanding of the material being covered in a class. It seems to me that if you give these various kinds of tests in sequence, you're moving from focus on information into something called understanding and appreciation. If students in their performance are able to show that they've gone along and they understand that, and that that indeed is happening with them, then that becomes evidence that the intellectual or educational quality in the course is meaningful. That's the way that student performance can indicate and help us measure educational quality. By looking at the performance and the development of each individual student, not continuing to focus on competition between one student and another over grades. Again, I think these ways of looking at this material, of this information, have value. And I wanted to present it here at the Virtual Center because I really do respect the ability of the people who listen to this program and who listen to the Head On Radio Network generally to not only understand and appreciate, but give me meaningful feedback on some of these ideas. For that, I thank you. We've actually gone 5 minutes beyond the top of the hour, and I understand that. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. Then we'll come back, and we'll pursue our second hour here at the Virtual Center on this Monday, the 9th day of October in the year 2017. We'll take a 5-minute break now, and we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour. Abbreviated though it is, it's 11 minutes after the hour. I want to thank Bob for the music and for the selection of music. He does a great job with that. He's been doing it forever, and I don't know where you find the time to present the variety of music that Bob shares with us during these breaks. But anyway, if you are just joining us, welcome to this Monday edition of the Virtual Center. Today is the 9th day of October in the year 2017. We are live, and I want to, first of all, let you know how glad I am that indeed we are live once again. It's great to be back with you. We had some illness strike the troops last week, and for a variety of reasons on different people. It's that time of year, again, if you know what I mean. When the seasons change, many of us find ourselves under the weather, and that's kind of what happened to a number of us last week, and I apologize for that, but I also am glad to be back with you. If you would like to get on the air and share your thoughts with us, we would love to hear from you. If you can get on the air with us by going through Skype, Bob Kincaid at Skype. And Bob is in the studio, and they will get you. Bob will get you on the air immediately if you choose to get on here with us. If you'd like to send me an email and trust me to get your thoughts and your ideas on the air, I would be honored to do that. My email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. It just dawned on me. I don't think I gave the address in the first hour, did I? But anyway, waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. And then I call your attention to our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, in the search box at the top, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you'll be onto our Facebook page. And on that page, I've got a number of postings, several of them associated with the class I'm teaching. I think the questions that I shared with you at the conclusion of our first hour, if I'm not mistaken, are on the Facebook page. But also, I put a couple of things on there of late. One, I believe I transcribed the article that I wrote on bump stocks, which we talked about at the beginning of our program today, and on the NRA. I believe I did. I didn't check on it today, but I meant to do that, and I think I did. And there are a couple of links on there as well. And we do invite your feedback and your comments on the Facebook page. You can make them on the page, you can drop me an email, or you can get on the air yourself and raise questions about some of the things we've done that way. In this, our second hour, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. I'd like to begin by looking at a piece that's in today's Washington Post on President Trump. More specifically, it's on President Trump's most recent conflict with one of his supporters, one of his more influential supporters, Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee. Many of you may be aware that just a few weeks ago, Senator Corker announced that he would not be running for re-election in 2018, that he would serve out his term, but that when his term ended, he would not run for re-election. This past weekend, despite the close relationship that the president has had with Senator Corker through the months of his presidency and even before that, there seemed to be a rift between these men that nobody suspected up until this past weekend. In fact, there was some talk before President Trump selected his vice presidential, Pence for his vice presidential candidate. There was some talk that if Trump won the election, he might ask Bob Corker to be his vice president. There was serious talk about that. I mentioned that only to suggest that the recent differences of opinion between Senator Corker and President Trump are quite significant and quite surprising to a number of people. In this morning's Washington Post, in this morning's Washington Post, James Hohmann writes a piece under the Daily 202 heading about Trump's weekend tirade against Senator Bob Corker. What might have caused it? What might have caused the president to react so strongly against Senator Corker? The author, James Hohmann, seems to think that the most plausible explanation for this difference of opinion between these two men was that the president was reacting to a segment on Fox News Sunday. On Fox News Sunday, the program presented a soundbite of Corker telling reporters last week that Rex Tillerson is one of the three people in the administration, quote, who separate our country from chaos, unquote. The implications of that statement suggests very negative things about the Trump presidency. It implies that the president is a loose cannon and that those around him know that and have to spend an inordinate amount of time keeping him on track, keeping him contained, as it were. You may recall that there was a report recently that in an interview, Senator Corker made comments about the president. This was in response to Charlottesville, the president's blaming both sides in the Charlottesville disturbance or demonstration. Corker made the point that the president is so new to the world of politics that he really doesn't fully understand the powers of the office or his responsibilities to all the citizens of this country. In other words, President Trump is learning on the job. And in a number of different situations, that can be very dangerous. And now this comment last week, and of course, what prompted this was President Trump's threat to fire Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. And there was some assumption that Tillerson was ready to resign. And you may recall the NBC report that in a meeting, in a White House meeting, Tillerson had referred to the president in front of the cabinet as a moron. And the president's immediate response to that, to challenge that, and Tillerson's efforts to deny it, although he never specifically denied saying it, but he did hold a press conference, if you'll recall, last week, in which he talked about how smart the president is. I have to admit that I was shocked when I heard the term moron, but I was even more shocked when I heard the word smart in reference to the president. But be that, that's myself. Anyway, Sunday, in a series of tweets, the president took out his hostility on Senator Corker. Quote, Senator Bob Corker begged me to endorse him for re-election in Tennessee. I said no, and he dropped out, said he could not win without my endorsement. He also wanted to be Secretary of State. I said no thanks. He is also largely responsible for the horrendous Iran deal. Hence, I would fully expect Corker to be a negative voice and stand in the way of our great agenda. Didn't have the guts to run, unquote. That's a summary of the 3 tweets that the president put out over the weekend on Senator Corker. Corker immediately responded on Twitter and basically suggested that the president is a little bit shaky, that the situation in the White House is constantly bordering on chaos. On the front page of the Washington Post yesterday, Sunday, Senator Corker talked about his party's hypocrisy on the national debt, said he would vote against any tax bill if he doesn't think it will reduce the deficit. Basically, the argument here is that Trump is shooting himself in the foot by getting into a kerfuffle with Senator Corker. Until he leaves office in January, after the next election, next November of 2018, Corker is an important committee chair in the Senate. President Trump needs him. Why would he do this? Why would he get into this with Senator Corker? When Corker heard these tweets coming from President Trump, he immediately contacted the New York Times, a reporter on the New York Times, in order to respond to what he called Trump's reckless threats to other countries that he believed could set the nation on the path to World War III, unquote. He concerns me, Corker said of President Trump. He would have to concern anyone who cares about our nation. I know for a fact that every single day at the White House, it's a situation of trying to contain him, unquote. So now we've got both sides involved in this kerfuffle. It's very obvious from the healthcare votes that every single Republican vote is critical if President Trump is going to get any kind of legislative agenda through the Senate. Consequently, why would he take on Senator Corker? This particular article in today's Washington Post suggests that the president is much more concerned at counterpunching when he's attacked than he is in getting programs and policies through Congress. A legislative agenda that's successful, according to this article, is not really President Trump's priority. And if you look at the history, you can begin to see it. The president has taken on several prominent Republican senators: Mitch McConnell, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Jeff Flake, Lisa Murkowski, Dean Heller of Nevada, Rand Paul, and now Bob Corker. During the campaign, of course, he went at Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Ben Sasse of Nebraska. Corker said that his concerns about Trump's ability to govern are shared by nearly every Republican in the United States Senate. Listen to this. Quote, "Look," Corker says, "except for a few people, the vast majority of our caucus understands what we're dealing with here. Of course, they understand the volatility that we're dealing with and the tremendous amount of work that it takes by people around him to keep him in the middle of the road," unquote. I think it's significant that seemingly this whole thing started by what the president saw on Fox News Sunday. Because one thing we know for sure is that the president watches often, reads, and thinks little. And the people around him know that as well. And according to according to the senator, are forced to act accordingly. Bob Corker, according to this article, is very close to Rex Tillerson. And therefore, he believes that Trump is in way over his head. Quote, "A lot of people think that there's some kind of good cop, bad cop act underway in our foreign policy, but that's just not true," Corker told the New York Times. And he's criticizing President Trump for undercutting Rex Tillerson last week when Tillerson was talking about secret negotiations with North Korea, and the president reacted to it by putting out the statement that Tillerson is wasting his time. There's only one thing that will get the attention of the North Korean dictator. The implication being that's military action. So Corker's statement, a lot of people seem to think that Tillerson and Trump is a kind of a good guy, bad guy, good cop, bad cop, are wrong. It's just not true, Corker says. "I know he has hurt in several instances. He's hurt us as it relates to negotiations that were underway by tweeting things out," said Corker. "I don't know why the president tweets out things that are not true," Corker told the New York Times. "You know he does it. Everyone knows he does it. But he continues to do it." I don't know whether this gives you a nervous sense like it does me, but it clearly does. It seems to me that we're dealing with a personality that will accept nothing less than physical or military action under the circumstances. Even though this president wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, it seems pretty clear to me that this president believes that trying to reach a deal is weakness. That what you have to do is strike back at those who attack you harder than they're able to strike you. It's kind of a real life version of the very famous expression of Theodore Roosevelt, walk softly but carry a big stick. Trump obviously subscribes to the adage that the guy with the biggest stick is the guy that wins the day. That seems to be his personality. That seems to be his inclination whenever a situation comes up like this. Took on John McCain, took on Mitch McConnell, took on any number of other members of his own party. And yet these are the people that all have to vote together in order to get major pieces of legislation through this Republican Senate. And the fact of the matter is, so far, 9 months into his administration, not one significant piece of legislation has come out of this administration. And that leads me to a real issue. This kind of actually is almost a throwback to hour number one in terms of the differences between these two kinds of exam questions. The kind of exam question that requires reflection and thought that you would give as part of a take-home exam, as opposed to an information-driven question which you would give in class, where students just get down as quickly as they can what they know on a particular issue. It seems to me that the difference is important. And it seems to me as well that that's kind of what they're dealing with, what we're dealing with, not only with the President of the United States, but with a worldwide trend that this president seems to be so much a product of, so much a champion of. Let me give you, if I can share this with you, what I'm talking about. This is an article that I've had for the last week, and I wanted to devote a significant portion of our time together to this particular issue. I'll be honest with you, we've gone beyond the bottom of the hour in our second hour, and I'm not really sure that we're going to have adequate time to deal with this article today. We may have to return to it in tomorrow's program. But if we do, that's fine. Today is the 9th day of October. 10 days ago, or 11 days ago, I guess, the 29th of September, in the New York Times, Roger Cohen wrote an article on the recent German elections that were held. I pulled this article because I believe it might be one of the most important articles I've read in a long time. It deals with the party in Germany, the new party in Germany, that won 94 parliamentary seats in the recent election. It's a party named Alternative for Germany. It's a right-wing party. It's the equivalent of Donald Trump in our politics. The major spokesman for this Alternative for Germany party, called in Germany the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, Alexander Gauland and Alice Weidel, are leading spokesmen for this AfD party in Germany, that in the most recent election was able to win 94 seats in parliament. It speaks to the strength of the right in German politics. Remembering, of course, that Germany is the place where the entire world learned about the right in the 1930s under Adolf Hitler. Germany spent much of its time since World War II was over undoing, trying to recover from, trying to speak to alternatives for the experience of Nazi Germany. What that means then is that this new party in Germany, the AfD party, winning 94 seats, is particularly striking because it's Germany. It kind of suggests that there's a trend happening. Or as Roger Cohen cites in this article, it brings back the words of Bob Dylan from the 1960s. Something's happening here, but you don't know what it is. Cohen's position is something is happening in Germany, and it's reflected in the 94 seats in Parliament awarded to this party of the right. The same party that led Great Britain out of the European Union. The same party mechanism that elected Donald Trump president of the United States. The same rightist party that the French people resisted in the last election by voting against Le Pen and the right wing in France. What Cohen speaks to, and this is the issue that I want to deal with, is the idea of what he calls in his title the German Volk, V-O-L-K. In German, Volk means people. The German people. After the election, when they won 94 seats, the spokesman for the AfD, Alexander Gauland and Alice Weidel, talked innocently about the fact that this was the first major step in Germany's effort to take back its Volk, its people. What does that mean, Cohen asks. Take back Germany from whom? The answer is unmistakable. Immigrants. Muslims. And then Cohen goes back to Hitler in the 1930s. During the 1930s, the clamor for Hitler was Führer, Volk, Vaterland. The Führer, the German people, the German nation, the fatherland. But we know so well that when Hitler used the word Volk, people, he didn't mean all the people. He meant the Aryans, the pure white Nordic blonde German race. The same people who set out to exterminate what Germans referred to as the Untermenschen, the subhumans, Jews, Slavs, gays. What Cohen is doing is raising the issue. When these right-wing Germans talk about taking Germany back for the people, what people is he talking about? Angela Merkel made a statement that in Germany, the people, the Volk, are anybody who lives in Germany. Anybody lives here is part of the Volk, part of the people. But the way Hitler used the term Volk, he meant a very specific group of people. And anybody who didn't fit into this definition of the Volk belonged to the so-called Untermenschen, the subhuman categories. And part of the final solution was to exterminate, to eliminate totally the Jews of the world. In order to cleanse humanity of being infected by the genes of people who weren't worthy to be part of the human community. What's the issue here? I would suggest to you that while these political rightists in Germany speak of the Volk, taking back Germany for the people, from whom? What we are seeing is an approach to the idea of Volk, which is exclusive, not inclusive. As a contrast to Angela Merkel's definition of the Volk as anybody who lives in Germany, Hitler had a very specific definition of who the Volk were. They were the Aryans. One has to wonder, how many times have we heard the president make reference to America's need to defend, quote, our people, unquote. Quote, we need a travel ban for certain dangerous countries, not some politically correct term that won't help us protect our people, unquote. Who does Trump mean when he refers to our people? Does he mean all the people? Does he mean everybody who lives here is contained within the term our people? Does he believe that he is president of all the people or of just a certain group of people? Are they our people? Unquote. His base. Who are they? What do they want? What do they stand for? What do they believe? Let me read you the paragraph in which Roger Cohen, defines what he believes the Volk means in today's Germany. He cites Bob Dylan's "Something's happening here, but you don't know what it is." That something, Cohen said, is a violent reactionary current. It is a rightist, nativist, nationalist, and yes, Volkish reaction against globalism, against migration, against immigrants, against miscegenation, against intermixing of the races, against the disappearance of borders, against the blurring of genders, against political correctness, against the stranger and the others, against the smug, self-interested consensus of an urban global elite. Unquote. That's what Roger Cohen believes the German Right Party means by taking back Germany for the Volk. The Volk isn't everybody in their mind. In fact, it is intentionally not everybody. Its goal is to exclude people, not include people. I ask you to think about this in terms of the decision in Great Britain early this past summer to take Britain out of the European Union, to stop the flow of immigrants coming into Great Britain, to protect jobs for British people, British citizens, not making them available for immigrants. And then I ask you to think about President Trump's position on restricting immigration, on banning immigration from 6 Muslim countries, on exporting non-citizens, even exporting the children of non-citizens, who, if they've been born in this country, are automatically granted citizenship. Not for long if President Trump has his way. Political scientists, in studying this past November's elections, have come up with a term that they believe helps to explain what helped to defeat Hillary Clinton in the last election. For lack of a better term, they call it identity politics. What really weakened the Democratic Party, say the pundits, was a campaign conducted by Democrats, especially by Hillary Clinton, aimed at particular ethnic groups. Campaigns and campaign ads that targeted Black Americans, that targeted the elderly, that targeted gays, the gay lesbian community, that targeted Hispanics. And the reality was that in aiming a campaign at all these different identity groups, the group that they took for granted, the group that they didn't even recognize as a group, were working class white Americans who were suffering and being hurt by the outflow of jobs, tax rates, immigration competition for jobs, lack of skills, all the rest of it. All the people that President Trump's digital staff were able to identify and aim the campaign at that particular group. In other words, the Democrats' engagement in identity politics helped sink Hillary Clinton because it appeared to working class, uneducated white Americans that the Democrats were more concerned about the rights of immigrants, the rights of criminals, the rights of religious minorities, the rights of gays and Hispanics and blacks, all those people that are different. That became the basis of what President Trump's campaign refers to as its base. That's the group that the president's campaign targeted and cultivated. Question: is that President Trump's vote? When he talks about our people and protecting our people and securing the borders in defense or for the protection of our people and preserving good jobs for our people, what specifically might he mean by that? The implication of Roger Cohen's article is that what President Trump represents and reflects is a global trend toward exclusion, toward the right, toward reactionary politics, toward nationalism, against globalism, against migration, against immigrants, against interracial marriage, against same-sex marriage, against the idea of political correctness. Translation: against civility, against treating others people with dignity, against strangers, against what the psychologists and sociologists refer to as the others, the people who are different from the mainstream, the people who don't belong. These are the people, these are the folk who resist international trade agreements, who resist globalism, who resist emphasis on climate, who resist science, who resist evidence that they don't like or don't support, who have come up with the idea of alternative facts, who are inclined to interpret news they don't like as fake news. These are the people that seek to exclude, not include. These are people whose priorities run counter to the traditions and the cultural priorities that make this nation what it is. It's not just happening here. It's happening all over. It's reflected in the German elections, in the French elections, in the British election. The decision to leave the European Union, so-called Brexit. Go it alone. Build walls. Don't need the rest of the world. Can't stomach globalism. Can't stomach immigration and cosmopolitanism. Want to return to the good old days of the 1950s, when everybody knew where everybody else stood. I would suggest that this article by Roger Cohen is one of the most important articles I've read in a long time. Not for the information it presents, but for the implications of that information in terms of what it means for all of us, in terms of what's happening and where we're going. The one thing that you can say about this group of people, they don't need to read. They don't need to be educated. They don't need to be informed. They just need to be recognized and appreciated. They just need to be isolated. I would suggest to you that this is a trend that I think all of us must recognize, and all of us must do everything we can do to counter. The basic premise of our political system, the idea of dialogue, negotiation, compromise, consensus, the idea of focusing on those things we agree on and de-emphasizing the things we don't agree on, those objectives, those goals run counter to the very essence of this particular definition of people, of Volk. Whereas the emphasis since the end of World War II in most of the developed world has been on opening borders, on commercial exchange, on international travel, on pluralism, on the complexity, the idea of a pluribus unum. This group of people supports and endorses everything contrary to that. They are on the march. They are gaining power. They are experiencing success in one nation after the other. We are witnessing it here. We have a president who doesn't need to read. He already knows. Those people around him who don't think that way are afraid of him. I think it's for those people that Bob Corker is making himself heard. I believe all of us would do well to listen carefully. We have reached the end of our program, the top of the hour. It is exactly the top of the hour right now. I want to thank you all for listening and for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network and of this program. I invite you back tomorrow. All things being equal, we should be here live. Let me remind you that our Tuesday programs begin 30 minutes later than our programs on Monday and Wednesday. So tomorrow's program will begin 1:30 Eastern Time, Eastern Daylight Time. This is Bill O'Brien for Bob, for Agnes, and the folks at Head On. Thank you so very, very much. I hope you have a great evening. Be kind to each other. And thank you.